Good morning. Today the committee meets to consider the following bills: H.R. 2711, the Citizen Empowerment Act; H.R. 1541, the Common Sense in Compensation Act; H.R. 1660, the Government Customer Service Improvement Act of 2013; H.R. 2579, the Government Employee Accountability Act; H.R. 899, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act of 2013; H.R. 1423, the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act; H.R. 2748, the Postal Reform Act of 2013; and H.R. 2793, the District of Columbia Financial Efficiency Act. I want to thank you all for being patient. As you can understand, the goal of this committee is to pass as many pieces of legislation on a bipartisan basis as possible, and we took a little extra time to make sure we did that. The committee will now consider H.R. 2748, the Postal Reform Act of 2013, and would the clerk please designate the bill?
H.R. 2748, a bill to restore the financial solvency of the United States Postal Service and to ensure the efficient and affordable nationwide delivery of mail.
Without objection, H.R. 2748 will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I will briefly recognize myself. The Postal Service isn't just broke. The Postal Service is far below insolvency. If we do nothing, last year's $15.9 billion loss and its default on payments to a previously agreed so-called pre-funding is now $11.1 billion in the hole. I want to commend the men and women of the Post Office for the hard work they have done, and to the leadership of the Post Office for the many things they have done in spite of Congress's inaction. Notwithstanding that, with the exception of the very bright spot of package delivery, something we will deal with today during the discussion, mail quantity, particularly first-class mail, the historic backbone of the Post Office, has declined by 25% since 2006. This is an institution that not only should be saved, and that it is a goal to save, but it must be saved. It protects taxpayers by providing an absolute Federal entity to ensure delivery to every point. That includes jury duty. That includes critical checks that may still be delivered through the mail. And more important, it delivers your right to communicate and be communicated with. Particularly rural residents and low-income Americans disproportionately depend on the Post Office. The Post Office continues to be the least expensive way to deliver, in many cases, to the four corners of our country. That is why I introduced H.R. 2748, the Postal Reform Act of 2013, and with my subcommittee chairman, Blake Farenthold, we have worked to try to take the bill that Chair Dennis Ross worked so hard on in the last Congress and make it as agreeable, as bipartisan, and as sensitive to the difficult situation that the men and women of the Post Office face, while still getting the numbers to come close to real balance. The restructuring of the Post Office itself will not happen the day this bill is signed. It certainly will not happen as we reported out today. It will take tough negotiations with the various trade groups. It will definitely take a number of areas that are difficult. The idea that delivering the same amount of mail for 6 days versus delivering it for 5 days, although obvious from an efficiency standpoint, is a cultural change for America. The leadership of the Postmaster General has been critical because his offering to ensure that we deliver 6 or even 7 days a week using priority mail offers us a viable alternative. For a few pennies more, the Post Office can ensure that people receive their mail any day, while at the same time getting us out from the delivery that often occurs of one less than 50-cent envelope being delivered to a home address one day and the next day another one. This ultimately is part of what's driving the cost. Delivery point modernization, which could save $4.5 billion, is also a key element of this legislation. We also want to recognize that there are historic preferences that need to be thought of and reconsidered. One of them that may be close to many of us on the dais, but which we know the time has come to deal with, is national political committees using nonprofit postage discounts to ultimately send out solicitations for money at a discount. Although it may be longstanding along with conventional charities, I think for all of us the right thing to do is to make sure that if we want to do political fundraising or organizational mail, that we do so at a rate that fully pays for the cost of that delivery. That and a number of other smaller items are part of the modernization we will do here today. But I want everyone to understand that the most important thing we do today is to attempt not to mandate changes, but to unleash the ingenuity, the innovation, and the hard work of people in the Post Office. The postal system has for a long time had a desire to innovate, and they have not had the authority to. Under this legislation, with the help of the ranking member, we will create within the Post Office a Chief Innovation Officer of the Postal Service. Additionally, we will protect rural post offices by allowing the concept of the post office remains there, but labor savings techniques allow that post office to be there, provide sufficient service, and do so at a lower total labor cost. There are other areas that are difficult and parochial. We have too many processing centers. The only problem is there are no excess processing centers in my district, the ranking member's district, the gentlemen and ladies down both sides of the dais. We know that because our constituents tell us that those jobs are important in our districts. The truth is, some districts are going to have to be winners by having additional employees in a consolidation for higher efficiency, and some will have those workers move to the other processing center. Our goal is to simply oversee the process, ensure that it is done fairly, but to stop the stopping of these changes, which will save money. Most importantly, this bill is different than 2 years ago. 2 years ago, this committee committed with the then Chairman, Joe Lieberman, Senator Joe Lieberman, that we would do all of the reforms, they would do a bill, and we would conference. What we have tried to do in this bill is to pre-conference the bill. To the greatest extent possible, we have tried to predict where we would end up coming out of conference. For example, we do not reopen contract negotiations or cause them to be reopened. We recognize that although it is costly not to make changes until the end of a contract period, that in fact it is where we should end up at the end of conference, so we are doing it today. I think it is particularly important because it is a concession that unions should not have to look at what they have already negotiated, but look forward to the next negotiation, harmonizing health care and other items that can be part of their negotiations as they go into the next round. They should have the ability to do. All we ask is that we be met halfway. I believe that is what we are asking for today, and I join with my partner, the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, and recognize him for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The enacting comprehensive postal reform legislation is one of the most critical tasks we face in this committee and in this Congress. Although insolvency does not appear to be imminent, the Postal Service is enduring unsustainable losses, and if we fail to act, the Postal Service will face a liquidity crisis. During the last Congress, a bipartisan postal reform bill was passed through the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and then passed on the Senate floor. It was not perfect, but it reflected the work of both Democrats and Republicans. Unfortunately, the bill in the House was passed through our committee on a strictly partisan basis and never reached the House floor. Given the urgent need for postal reform, I am disappointed today that the majority again has chosen to bring before the committee a partisan bill that I and my colleagues on this side of the aisle simply cannot support. I acknowledge and applaud the important changes the Chairman has made to the legislation he circulated a few weeks ago, and I sincerely thank him for including provisions in H.R. 2748 that I authored in my Innovate to Deliver bill. These provisions would create a Chief Innovation Officer to oversee the development of new products and services to enable the Postal Service to capitalize on new business opportunities. These provisions also would require members of the Postal Regulatory Commission and the Board of Governors to report on their travel expenditures. Unfortunately, the bill before us today still includes a number of extreme provisions that would degrade existing postal services and duly burden the Postal Service with additional debt and harm postal employees. For example, although this bill instructs the Office of Personnel Management to recalculate the Postal Service's FERS surplus using postal-specific criteria, the bill would not use any of that surplus to provide liquidity to the Postal Service. Instead, the Postal Service would be required to take on additional debt from the Treasury to meet its operating cost. Although the Chairman has eliminated provisions contained in his earlier draft that would have abrogated existing union agreements, the bill before us today continues to intrude improperly in negotiations between the Postal Service and its employees by prohibiting labor contracts that do not allow the Postal Service to unilaterally lay off or dismiss employees, including those who have decades of service. The bill also includes provisions that would remove postal workers from the existing Federal Workers' Compensation System and establish a postal-specific system that would provide lower benefits than those available to other Federal employees. H.R. 2748 also would end 6-day mail delivery immediately. And like the draft legislation released by the Chairman a few weeks ago, this bill seeks to eliminate door delivery in our nation by 2022. This draft includes a new provision that would enable people currently receiving door delivery to continue receiving such delivery if they pay a new delivery fee. This provision threatens to create a Cadillac lane within our nation's Postal Service by enabling those who can pay for the privilege to continue receiving door delivery, while requiring families who do not qualify for a waiver and cannot afford the door delivery fee to convert to a curbside or cluster box delivery point. There are many different paths available that would enable us to develop common ground solutions that will put the Postal Service on a sustainable financial path while winning bipartisan support in Congress. Unfortunately, the legislation before us today does not choose this path. At the appropriate time, an amendment in the nature of a substitute based upon the Innovate to Deliver Act I introduced last week. The legislation would enable the Postal Service to operate more like a business. It was meant to be by compassionately right-sizing the workforce, providing urgently needed liquidity without increasing the Postal Service's debt, and preserving critical services. I urge members to support this approach and reject extreme measures of H.R. 2748. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to recognize for a brief opening statement the Chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as Chairman of the Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, U.S. Postal Service, and the Census, I'm glad we're here today with a solution that saves the United States Postal Service. And after listening to the ranking member, I understand that while we differ in our approaches in some areas, we are committed to finding a solution, hopefully, that we can all live with. And we can't let the perfect get in the way of the doable. Some people have issues with some parts of this bill, and that's why we're having this markup. But we must keep in mind that the U.S. Postal Service is in dire financial straits, and it is our obligation as the elected representatives of the people to save the Postal Service. In today's markup, we'll work together, I hope, to pass the Postal Reform Act of 2013. This bill is a new and improved method of addressing many of the concerns that have been brought up in previous bills and the numerous hearings we've had on the Postal Reform Act. It provides the tools necessary to build a stable future for our Post Office, for its employees, and for our country. Moving to a modified Saturday delivery and cluster boxes alone could save as much as $8 billion annually. These are only two of the simple and obvious changes that need to be made when hard mail volume continues to decline. The role of the Postal Service has changed. It needs new, innovative solutions that will make it fiscally sound for the future. The Postal Service, this committee, and Congress can't bury its head in the sand, ignoring billions in deficits, technology changes that are lowering demands, and a huge liability for employee benefits. Today, I'm hopeful together we can use what we've learned from past mistakes and work in a bipartisan manner to pass this bill and take the first steps toward saving the United States Postal Service. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else? We now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ranking member as well. I'd like to, as the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee on the U.S. Postal Service, I'd like to offer my strongest opposition to H.R. 2748, the so-called Postal Reform Act of 2013. As we continue to undertake the critical task of reform in the United States Postal Service in order to better ensure its long-term sustainability, it's very important that we remain ever mindful of the unique and irreplaceable role of the Postal Service and its dedicated employees in American society. Above all, the Postal Service and our postal workforce stand as a genuine testament to essential government service, as stated in Section 101A of Title 39 of the U.S. Code, and I will quote, "The Postal Service shall have as its basic function the obligation to provide postal services to bind the nation together through the personal, educational, literary, and business correspondence of the people." It goes on to say it shall provide prompt, reliable, and efficient services to patrons in all areas and shall render postal services to all communities, close quote. This is the mission of the United States Postal Service. We sometimes refer to it as universal service. And this is a commitment to exceptional service, not partisanship nor politics. And I think that the section that I just quoted should serve as our guiding principle in the work that we do here today. Regrettably, however, H.R. 2748 in its current form would mandate a series of damaging and misguided changes to postal operations that I strongly believe would only serve to undermine the core mission that has long defined the United States Postal Service and its extraordinary employees, and has inspired the American public year in and year out to name the Postal Service as its most trusted government agency. In particular, as American business and the American consumer have adjusted to a 6-day business week, this bill, as proposed, would immediately reduce mail delivery to 5 days a week, moving in an opposite direction, and thereby eliminating an essential postal service competitive advantage. On this issue, I would note that the resolution proposed by Mr. Graves of Missouri and Mr. Connolly of Virginia in the current Congress reflects the widespread support that preservation of 6-day mail delivery continues to receive on both sides of the aisle. H.R. 2748 also seeks to phase out another key postal service by eliminating almost all door delivery of mail in favor of curbside or cluster box delivery, and even contemplates requiring conversion-eligible postal customers to pay a legacy fee in order to retain the ability to have their mail delivered to their door, which they have grown accustomed to. Moreover, the Chairman's bill would significantly expedite the review process for consolidations and closures, and therefore further limit the opportunity for meaningful community and stakeholder input in decisions to close their local post office. By imposing limitations on future this is a section that I think is a direct slap in the face to the postal unions, who if you review the most recent contracts, have asked for extremely modest increases, 1%, 1%, 1.5% in successive years, They've really, and also introduced temporary employees where they never have done that before, coming in at lower rates than existing postal employees. So in return for this good faith bargaining, this bill imposes limitations on collective bargaining. That collective bargaining has served us very, very well in this process. And I just give great credit to the postal unions for the good faith and decency with which they've approached the challenges that we face here today. This bill would even authorize an additional $5 billion in borrowing. There are better ways to do this than to rely on the taxpayer for another $5 million in borrowing authority when we haven't made basic changes that I think would help the Post Office, and we haven't removed unnecessary burdens that we have imposed on the Postal Service. Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate the continued efforts to examine the challenges facing the Postal Service. I simply do not believe that we can set the Postal Service on a path toward financial stability by promoting a decline in its key and distinguishing services and by treating the postal employees the way we have in this bill. So with that, I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation in its current form, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I look forward to its current form being offered for change. I will hold the record open until the end of the day so members may submit written statements. Does anyone wish to speak on the bill? The gentlelady from New York. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for moving this conversation and debate forward. And we all know postal reform is something that needs to happen, and I hope we can work on it in a bipartisan, constructive way. I have some very serious concerns with H.R. 2748, the Postal Reform Act, particularly as it pertains to services and protecting workers' rights. This bill requires a dramatic downsizing of the Postal Service, reduces customer service by moving to a 5-day delivery, and guts collective bargaining agreements. I greatly oppose these kinds of initiatives that hurt seniors, businesses, and take a major step back in the rights of hardworking letter carriers. These kinds of initiatives not only hurt seniors, rural communities, and low-income urban areas, but many businesses and postal workers will be hurt. I do want to commend the Chairman for including in his discussion draft the underwater classes provision to address the problem of mail classes whose rates do not always cover their costs, such as magazines. I also want to commend Ranking Member Cummings for his bill and for amending it to include this provision. But his Innovate to Deliver Act is a truly fine proposal. This provision prevents a seriously negative impact on the magazine publishing industry, which employs a great number of people in our country. The draft takes a sensible approach on the issue, delaying the implementation of any rate increases on periodicals and other so-called underwater classes of mail until the Postal Service has time to remove excess costs from the system. After 2 years of reforms at the Postal Service, if periodicals do not cover 90% of their true costs, a reasonable rate increase of 2% would go into effect. I am also concerned about the closing of post offices, some of which are very heavily used and extremely popular and supported by the community. I will be offering an amendment later that will require information on the cost benefit, the impact, what are the decisions that go into making a decision to close a post office. It seems to me that if a post office is making money and generating money for the post office, then it should continue to provide that service, provide that employment, and help the post office's bottom line. So I will be offering that later. At this time, I want to thank the Ranking Member and the Chairman and all the members that worked on this proposal, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? I'll recognize myself briefly just to speak on it and then go to the gentleman from Virginia. The gentlelady's amendment that will come up later today, I look forward to seeing and discussing. We have looked at it, and we do believe the spirit of it is right. So I look forward to, and I don't know if you will get back to offer it soon, but I look forward to, if we can't take it up today, ensuring that there is perfecting language as part of Ranking Member Cummings' innovation that would cause a test to be done of profitability before post offices can be closed. And quite frankly, wherever they are, but urban areas such as your district are particularly ones that come to mind. So I'll look forward to that. Additionally,
Mr. Chairman, may I just thank you? Will you yield
you're
me
most
time?
welcome.
I thank the Chairman for yielding me time. I appreciate his gracious offer to work with me, and with that spirit, I will be withdrawing this amendment to work with Mr. Cummings and to work with you on appropriate language. Thank you very much.
I look forward to that. And that I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this markup. I want to echo the comments of my colleagues, Mr. Cummings and Mr. Lynch. I think they cogently laid out the critique. I appreciate the fact that this time we are marking up a bill with more of a spirit of welcoming bipartisanship, a spirit singularly absent last time we marked up postal reform. However, what is in front of us is a stark choice. We are being asked to accept the premise that we almost have to kill the Postal Service to save it. I believe that is a false premise and a false choice, and presents us with a series of false choices. What the Post Office needs certainly is reform. Changes do need to be made. The Chairman is right about that. But the question, obviously, is which changes need to be made? And have we brought to bear careful, cogent analysis to ensure ourselves that we are not unwittingly doing harm, or perhaps wittingly do harm? It seems to me that it is quite clear that there is a view that by cutting back service, whether it be the days of delivery or the kinds of mail delivered or where they are delivered, and severely cutting back on the workforce and on facilities, somehow we are going to revive the Postal Service in America. It seems to me that actually if we do it that way, we are almost surely condemning the Postal Service to an accelerated decline. We need to create a new business model for the Postal Service. And that means we have to address the 2006 legislation head-on. We have to alleviate the Postal Service of the prepayment requirement. We have to allow the Postal Service to let 1,000 flowers bloom so that we know what combination is efficacious, what works. The 2006 legislation severely constrains the Postal Service from that. We have to get the Postal Service out of the stovepipe presence in our communities and make it more of a focal point for lots of activities, whether it be driver's license, local government offices, even commercial enterprises, for those commercial enterprises that want to sign a contract with the Postal Service to co-locate and co-function. That's what we need to be doing. Cutting back on home delivery in urban areas in this country will be a profound lifestyle change that will affect constituents all across this country, 30 million of them according to this bill. There is a better way to do this. 1789 in the Senate pointed the way. It wasn't a perfect bill, but it did create a framework for common ground that brought Republicans and Democrats together and that brought thoughtful analysis to the issue. Ms. Maloney just highlighted the fact that all across America, unilateral decisions were made by the management of the Postal Service without almost any analysis whatsoever to justify it. My hometown newspaper, the Washington Post, highlighted an example in McLean where a post office that was profitable was just unilaterally closed by the Postal Service, irrespective of the fact that it contributed to the bottom line rather than costing. If that's the analysis we're relying on, we're in deep trouble. And I think that we have to insist that as moving forward, as decisions are being proposed, that they can be backed up with numbers. It's almost a theological divide among us whether we go from 6 to 5. But the Postal Regulatory Commission raised serious questions about the Postmaster's analysis on that issue, that the savings are overstated and what isn't taken into account is lost revenue that accompanies that kind of so-called cost savings. So I wish I could support the Chairman's bill, because I know he's looking for support on our side of the aisle, and that's a good thing. I am going to support the substitute being offered by Mr. Cummings, and my hope is that as we move forward after this markup, we will continue to try to find common ground, despite the fact that we have radically different views about the role of the Postal Service and its future. With that, Mr. Chairman,
would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I'm happy to yield the Chairman.
Thank you. I would say we are not radically different. I'd say we're a lot closer than not. And with that, I thank you, and I would like to now recognize the ranking member, who I understand has an amendment you're speaking of.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2748, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
As I said in my opening remarks, I'm offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute based on the Innovate to Deliver Act, H.R. 2690, which I introduced last week. My legislation would not intrude in negotiations between the Postal Service and labor unions. It would not move postal employees to a new workers' compensation system or reduce the benefits available to postal workers injured on the job below those available to all other Federal workers. My legislation would not end Saturday delivery of first-class and standard mail. My legislation would not end door delivery at the locations currently receiving it, nor would it require Americans to pay a special new fee to continue receiving mail at their doors. Instead, the amendment would enable the Postal Service to function more like the business it was intended to be. My legislation would create a new Chief Innovation Officer charged with leading the development of products and services that enable the Postal Service to meet changing customer demands. My legislation would also authorize the Postal Service to offer a wide range of new non-postal products that capitalize on its retail and delivery networks. The legislation would amend the schedule for the retiree health benefits prepayments by requiring that 80% of the current liability be funded and by postponing payments until 2016. The amendment would recalculate the Postal Service's obligations to the FERS system using postal-specific characteristics. If, as the Postal Service's Inspector General has indicated, this recalculation determines that the Postal Service has paid into the system more than it needs to meet its obligations, that surplus would be returned to the Postal Service to provide liquidity. If surpluses are identified in future years, that money would be used to pay the Postal Service's liabilities to the Civil Service Retirement System and the Retiree Health Benefit Fund. Recognizing the need to seek common ground, my amendment eliminates the language I previously included in my Innovate to Deliver Act and would have required the PRC to revisit the rate cap put in place in the 2006 postal reform legislation. Instead, I have included provisions from Chairman Iss's bill that requires the PRC to raise the rates on underwater products each year by the amount of unused rate authority plus 2%. This will generate new revenue for the Postal Service while providing certainty for mailers. My amendment also includes several provisions authored by Congressman Connolly, including the text to H.R. 1431, which would ensure that management and non-career employees in the Postal Service can appeal adverse personnel actions to the Merit System Protection Board, a right enjoyed by other Federal employees. Finally, my amendment would give the Postal Service the ability to right-size its workforce with the compassion befitting employees who have given decades of service to this institution. The amendment would permit the Postal Service to offer employees additional service credits to incentivize their retirement. Employees under the Civil Service Retirement System could receive up to 1 year of additional service credit, while employees under FERS could receive up to 2 years of credit. Employees who receive service credit would not be eligible for buyouts. The amendment respects the service of the postal employees. It provides urgently needed liquidity without burdening the Postal Service with an additional debt, and it reduces the unfair requirement to pre-fund 100% of future retiree health benefits. I believe my amendment offers a better path to returning the Postal Service to a sustainable future by preserving its existing services while positioning it to provide products and services that meet our nation's changing communication needs. I urge members to adopt my amendment, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I'm going to oppose this amendment, but not because the gentleman from Maryland hasn't worked in good faith. Our committees have worked tirelessly to try to narrow the difference. There are a number of concerns I have on his version of the bill, even though he has accepted some of my ideas, and I clearly have accepted some specific items from your legislation. Here are some of the areas of concern. First of all, looking at your amendment, it would most assuredly result in a 20 to 30% across the board or broad tax rate increase because of the areas that it limits in reduction. We have a fundamental difference in how we create the working capital for this semi-private government enterprise, whether we provide it by taking items such as the FERS overpayment and allowing it to be spent, or we assume that these numbers can rise and fall and provide instead more working capital through the low-cost borrowing mechanism of using the Treasury, which is pegged, as you know, at essentially less than the inflation rate. My belief is that business-like activity would be to expand the debt amount. Notwithstanding that, I fully expect that by the time we come out of conference, all of the money that we provide, and perhaps significant amounts more even than you envisioned, may be needed in order to get the Post Office to a break-even. One of the reasons is that in your legislation, not dealing with door delivery versus curb delivery is a fundamental challenge difference to allowing attrition to help us out of the letter carrier excess. And let me explain that briefly, because I think the ranking member and I both want to achieve the same thing, but in this case, there is a difference. Our view is that people who have actual physical needs should continue to get the unique care that the Post Office can give, whether you are in rural America, up a long country road, or just a few steps from the street in Baltimore, Maryland. If you need the service, Post Office will walk all the way to your door with the package or letter. However, 2 out of every 3 Americans do not enjoy door delivery except in that case. Our challenge is that 1 out of 3 Americans receive a Cadillac service. They didn't ask for a Cadillac service. It's an accident of history. If their house was built before the 1970s in an urban area, they likely have door delivery. On my home here in Northwest Washington, I have that door delivery. I didn't ask for it. It's a quirk of my older home in an urban area. But that cost between $4 and $6 billion a year of excess labor. So for 1/3 to cost $6 billion in savings and 2/3 to not enjoy the benefit, it would create an initial problem. However, working with this postmaster and even his predecessor, what we discovered is that there is an additional challenge to modernize the Post Office, to give them the optimum opportunity to have a unique deliverable A secure box, particularly in urban areas, is actually an asset, not a liability. When people hear street delivery or they hear cluster boxes, they often go, my goodness, I'm going to have to walk 10 feet, 20 feet, several hundred feet. What they forget is a dry, locked location for their medicines, a dry, locked location for their package will now be available in that 200-foot walk that today isn't. Residents of high-rise apartments and condominiums in Washington and in Baltimore and around the country already go to their lobby and go and see that typically, and in fact recognize that although it would be nice to have it stuck in their door, it wouldn't be good to have that Amazon purchase left at their door only to disappear. So there are a number of other areas, and I'll be brief. I think the ranking member and I will work hard and together in conference with the Senate, but FECA reform is a particular area. We place a place marker in our bill, and we place it there because the Senate has boldly and broadly moved on a series of reforms. The House has not moved at all, not for postal workers and not for the rest of the Federal workforce. At the end of the day, we will not make FECA reform from this committee. We will simply go into conference with the Senate, broadly accept probably all or most of what they have in their reform, and work with it. So for my ranking member and friend, I would say it's a place marker. I hope that you will understand that. And if you look to Senator Carper and his team in the Senate, that's where the negotiation on the best way to treat these disabled, long-standing employees of the Post Office. And with that, I would urge a no vote, yield back, and ask if anyone else wants to speak on the amendment. The senior gentleman, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to express my strong support for Mr. Cummings' amendment and the need for a substitute. This thoughtful amendment is based in large part on his earlier work, the Innovate to Deliver Act of 2013, comprehensive postal reform legislation. This amendment seeks to enhance the financial viability of the United States Postal Service without compromising delivery standards or unfairly punishing our dedicated postal workforce. In stark contrast to the drastic and damaging changes to the postal operations mandated by the Chairman's bill, the substitute amendment proposes a series of practical steps that we could take to place the Postal Service on more solid financial footing. In addition to encouraging the Postal Service to further develop its postal-related products and technology, Mr. Cummings' amendment would revise the overly burdensome annual payment schedule set by the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006. As I am sure many of us are too aware, this 2006 requirement directed the agency, unlike any other public or private entity, to pre-fund its future retiree benefits 75 years in advance and within a 10-year period. The amendment introduced by Mr. Cummings would also encourage the Postal Service to continue offering early retirement buyouts and voluntary separation incentives by allowing postal employees the opportunity to receive additional service credits under the Federal Employees Retirement System and the Civil Service Retirement System. Moreover, I thank Mr. Cummings for including language from my legislation, H.R. 961, the United States Postal Service Stabilization Act, to require the Office of Personnel Management to consider the unique position, salary, growth, and demographic characteristics of postal employees when calculating the Postal Service's Federal Employee Retirement System surplus. Similar to 961, the substitute amendment would allow the Postal Service to utilize any resulting surplus, and we think it is considerable, maybe between $11 and $12 billion. They may use that surplus determined in the first applicable fiscal year to pay down its $15 billion debt to the Treasury and enhance agency liquidity. Let me also underscore what the substitute amendment does not do. Unlike H.R. 2748, the Chairman's bill, this amendment would not require the Postal Service to shift to 5-day mail delivery and deprive the agency of essential business advantage, an essential business advantage that it holds over its competitors. Unlike the Chairman's bill, this amendment would not phase out another key customer service feature by eliminating door delivery with curbside delivery. Nor does this amendment contemplate a shift to so-called neighborhood cluster boxes. Unlike H.R. 2748, this amendment would not impose unwarranted restrictions on future collective bargaining agreements negotiated by postal management and the good Postal Service employees. Mr. Chairman, for all these reasons, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support common-sense postal reform and vote in favor of the substitute amendment offered by Mr. Cummings. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mica, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I speak, unfortunately, in opposition to the ranking member's alternative that he's presented today. All you have to do is look through the title of his recommendations, and you begin to absolutely shudder about opening the door for the Postal Service to get into a whole new range of areas. They already have a monopoly on postal service and have unfortunately failed, and not at their own cause. I pointed out to staff this little mobile communications device has changed the way of life as we know it. And the changes we've seen to date and the impact on the Post Office folks are just the very beginning. The Post Office is will be an antiquated means of communications in the future. But to think that the solution, well, first of all, no one says you're going to kill it to reform it. It's already been mortally wounded. What we're trying to do is stop the bleeding. Some of the ideas here, for example, investment of competitive products money. Now, here, let's look at this. The authority to ship beer, wine, and distilled spirits. Oh, my God. Getting the Post Office into that, I think you're looking for a disaster. That is not a solution. That's a disaster about to happen. There are already means of shipping those in a competitive, cost-effective fashion. But the solutions that have been proposed in this document, enhanced product innovation. Folks, probably one of the least creative entities ever created by the Federal Government is the Post Office and most of our bureaucracy. They do not innovate. And to get them into a whole host of areas, and then investment of competitive products money, and they expect a return to make up the $15, $16 billion in loss. And they continue to harp on the pre-funding problem. The pre-funding problem is just a pimple on an elephant's back. This is a much bigger problem. I think our side has tried to work with folks to put out a solution that does give them the ability to move forward, the tools necessary. There are going to have to be some very serious changes in labor and operations practices that we do allow. But going down the road will take the postal, with this proposal, just look at it, will take us further over the cliff of insolvency and make the situation worse rather than better. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Before I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, well, I think it's already been recognized, but I want to announce that we will be using the committee rule to roll votes. Importantly, for members who may have other markups and other consideration, the intent of the Chair is to give approximately 15 minutes notice before a vote. The exception would be as if we simply run out of all business, then we will give you a reasonable amount of notice, but when we're mostly here, we'll be here. If we have an interim vote, I will time the interim vote, unless it's a procedural vote, I will time the interim vote to a vote on the House floor. So do check with your offices if you go to the House floor for the possibility that we're going to vote after you come back from the floor, because I know I can get y'all's attention then. Other than that, there will be no blind sides. And Ranking Member, do you have any statement of that work for your side? Okay. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
You move to strike the last word?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chair. I am happy to support the Ranking Member's substitute bill because it does what we talked about a little bit earlier. It promotes innovation rather than strangling the Postal Service as the 2006 legislation does, which seems a bill that is failure by design. It strangles the Postal Service, and then a few years later, we're shocked, the Postal Service is running in the red, even though we helped create the framework to guarantee that. Yes, there are market forces. My friend from Florida points out technology means that, instead of sending a first-class letter to Mom, I simply email her. But that same technology also creates business. The Chairman mentioned Amazon. When you order something online, it still physically has to be delivered. We have not yet figured out virtual delivery, and that means the Postal Service. And that's the fastest growing part of new business for the Postal Service, not surprisingly. So there are opportunities available to us if we allow innovation in the Postal Service. Having a Chief Innovation Officer is a great start. Allowing the Postal Service to be unshackled and experiment in new and potentially profitable lines of business to augment the core mission is a good thing. This bill allows that. Secondly, it protects service standards. It doesn't make that change in urban areas and eliminate home delivery to 30 million Americans. Now, my family lives in an older part of Boston. And there is simply no land in their neighborhood or on their street or anywhere near them to put up cluster boxes. The urban setbacks are severe. The road almost comes to the house. I wish the Chairman was right that in that kind of urban area, my folks would only have to walk a few blocks to pick up their mail. They'd have to walk a half a mile or a mile. And that, by the way, would put them in the cemetery. That's the nearest open land on LaGrange Street in West Roxbury, which is represented by my good friend, Stephen Lynch. And there are other areas. When you're in an urban area, what could go wrong, even if you could find land for a cluster box, in terms of this huge service standard change, what could go wrong? Well, they're elderly, they have disabilities, they're infirm, and they're worried about crime. They are worried about security. And that personal relationship with the postman or postwoman, helps anchor neighborhoods. It's a long, long pattern that we're proposing to break. In the majority's bill, we're proposing to protect in the Ranking Member's bill. Protecting service standards, I think, is an important thing and an important value, and it is something that differentiates us. And finally, there's fairness. Fairness not only to customers, but fairness to the men and women who make the Postal Service work by protecting their rights. Too much has already been said by management and some of us here in Congress that I think has done terrible damage, both in morale and productivity. We're going to change FECA standards just for you. We're going to pull you out of FEHBP and hope for the best, that somehow standalone health benefit programs for the postal workers will be viable. We've had testimony before this committee that that's not so. That's not so. And collective bargaining rights, hard fought, hard won. It's a contract. It's important to be honored. The Ranking Member's bill protects those fairness standards for customers and workers alike. I urge my colleagues to vote for this substitute. I think it's a thoughtful way to go forward. I think it gives us the potential for common ground and something that can be positively conferenced with our friends in the Senate subsequently.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course, Mr. Chairman.
I would hope the gentleman recognizes that the underlying bill, in addition to the Ranking Member's amendment, does maintain full contract sanctity with all union negotiations. We do not interrupt any contracts. We only specify elements, harmonized elements, in a renegotiation so that they negotiate over items other than those items which are harmonized throughout the Federal workforce.
If I may respond, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I take your point, and I think that's a good point. But I would note that it was not so long ago we had an alternative bill passed on a party line vote in this committee that gutted collective rights of workers. And there is reason for postal workers to be concerned that, given that history, that this is sort of dicey business as we move forward. So while I certainly welcome the change, there is reason, given recent history, nonetheless to be concerned. And that's why I am glad that from the beginning the ranking member has enshrined respect for those collective rights without that anxiety, if the Chairman takes my point.
Well, I'm not sure I get the point, because if you can take agreement for an answer, you take agreement for an answer. We're respecting and not asking for a reopening of any existing contracts for consideration. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you
move
very
to strike
much.
the last word. You recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I do move to strike the last word. I'm troubled by the fact that we're turning this into something that's very partisan. As the chairman of the subcommittee, I've worked very hard listening to everybody's concerns. And if you look at what we introduced, we've taken many of Ranking Member Cummings' ideas and included them in the base bill. We've created the Chief Innovation Officer. We've worked with solving some of the pension issues. We've worked with granting authority for non-postal activities within the Post Office, specifically relating to state governments. But we also don't want to get into a situation to where the Post Office is competing with other businesses. So we struck a very delicate balance there. I'm also concerned about a lot of the talk about what a bad thing cluster boxes are. I do want to point out that the bill, and this was something I worked very strong for, is an exception to the cluster box or street side delivery requirement to those who have a physical need, the elderly, the disabled. We don't want to make them do something that they can't or is difficult for them to do. So there is an exception in place. There's also an exception in place where if you want the door delivery, you pay the cost of that door delivery. So those of us who get our mail, in Corpus Christi, I get my mail on a street side box. Here in Washington, D.C., what little mail I do get, I get in a box in the lobby of my building. And it's actually a better situation there, because when a package is delivered, there in most of the urban cluster boxes, like the ones I had in college, there was a big box at the bottom where they put the packages in, and then they stuck the key to that box in your individual box. So rather than leaving medications or some valuable electronics that you've mail ordered sitting on your front door, like they do now in Corpus Christi, I'm now having stuff shipped to Washington for the security, and I stick it in my suitcase because I worry sometimes about it being left out in the front yard. The cluster box really does serve this. There's talk about the 6-day competitive advantage. Well, the only competitors that the Post Office has right now are package delivery services. There's no competitor for first-class mail. The reforms we're proposing here preserves the delivery of packages on Saturday, maintaining that competitive advantage. So that doesn't go away. And as Mr. Mica pointed out, I'm concerned about the delivery of alcohol. You know, the Constitution, the repeal of prohibition, let me get it right, I'll read it exactly. The transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for the delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is prohibited. That would mean the Postal Service would have to comply with the liquor laws of every single state. And quite frankly, with someone who has daughters that just turned 21 and can drink legally now, I would be concerned that when they were 16, 17 years old, mail order beer might have been a very attractive solution for them, working with somebody to be there to accept delivery for them, or having it left on the side. It's just, bad thing there. So I think we've worked really hard to come up with a bipartisan solution. And I think as we go through today, and I don't want to put words in Chairman Iss's mouth, but I think you'll find that on almost any issue that is brought up that we can find a reasonable accommodation on, we're going to do it. The post office needs to be saved. It needs to be done in a bipartisan manner, and we want to come up with a bill that everybody can live with, and that's why we're here today. And I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
I want to thank the gentleman. I do want to bring up a point you brought up, which is the delivery of alcohol. The gentlelady, I'm afraid she stepped out for a moment, but the gentlelady from California had an amendment which we have been working to evaluate. We find that it falls under Title 18, meaning the jurisdiction of another committee. However, we do find that there is a technical problem that this committee should try to address with the other committee. And when Ms. Speer returns, we'll have a colloquy. But I want to make sure that people understand that UPS currently does pick up certain spirits, and the last mile delivery of UPS in rural areas is the post office. And it currently seems to be kind of one of those interesting conundrums in that the post office cannot deliver on behalf of its contract items for another service to that last mile. So we're going to have a colloquy to try to work on something before it goes to the floor that addresses the fact that there has been both court decisions and history now of services that do deliver under certain specific provisions with safety. And we want to make sure that the post office is not adversely locked out of participating in that revenue. And I know the gentleman's worked hard on that, and I thank him for recognizing me.
And reclaiming my time, my concern, of course, with that is, and as we work forward with the gentlelady from California, perhaps we can address that, is really putting the rank-and-file postal employee being responsible for enforcing the liquor laws of 50 states and the territories of the country.
Thank you. I think appropriately, since the gentlelady from California is here, we could take that up at her time. Do you move to strike last word?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I did step out, so I didn't actually hear your question, and now you're talking to someone else. You can't.
Thank the gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, I had stepped out, so do you have a question you want to
Yeah, I was mentioning to the chairman of the subcommittee that the amendment that we had looked at from you, or your bill and an amendment you proposed offering, we've spoken to the Judiciary Committee, who is sympathetic to the conundrum of UPS and others being able to deliver, but the last mile delivery being the post office is currently not covered. And although if we accepted your amendment, it would trigger a referral to their committee and probably be adverse. The chairman has said that he is interested and favorable to your proposal in principle. And so what we're going to try and do is, before this goes to the floor, have a resolution that would empower the post office to actually be able to execute under their contract these aspects and so on. But Title 18 would immediately go to Judiciary. So I was explaining that because this chairman wants the post office to be able to compete and to provide services. In this case, it's a combination of both. At the same time, it's not within our it's not within our jurisdiction. So I did looking at your amendment, which was being considered, that is from your bill, which has already been referred, I believe, to Judiciary. I wanted you to be sure that we take it seriously. Chairman Goodlatte is in many ways very favorable to it and wants to work on it. As you know, he's a champion of Internet and other deliveries that often trigger those kinds of deliveries.
I thank the Chairman for that. If I may, on my own time, I really think that if we're serious about fixing the fact that there is a $45 billion debt owed by the Postal Service to the taxpayers of this country, that one of the things we have to do is give the Postal Service the latitude to compete with everyone else. And you can't, on the one hand, tie their hands and say, be successful, and on the other hand, expect them to succeed. the Postal Service already provides for UPS and FedEx and everyone else delivery for the last mile. Now, there's a reason why that is. It would be much more costly for UPS and FedEx to deliver to that last mile. So they looked at an opportunity to use the Postal Service to assist them in their profitability. I think that if we are serious about making sure that the Postal Service can innovate, that we've got to unlatch their hands from the shackles that we have placed them in, and one of the ways would be to allow them to deliver wine and liquor. Now, to the gentleman's, to the chairman, the subcommittee chairman's point, let's not be silly about this. There's not a college student in this state or in this country that doesn't know how to get liquor by going to someone who's 21, who has a driver's license, who can go in and buy the liquor for them. To somehow suggest that this is going to be the new way that college students access liquor is laughable. I yield back.
Would the gentlelady yield? Would the gentlelady yield?
I certainly will.
This is the gentlelady raises the issue, Mr. Chairman, and the subcommittee chairman, that concerns me greatly, and that is that on the one hand, we say to the Postal Service, we want you to be innovative, but then we tie their hands. I remember when Mr. Ross was subcommittee chairman, he made a big deal up saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. Some kind of way, we can't say go out there and be innovative and then say, look, 99.99% of anything you might be innovative doing, you can't do. So I think it's a little bit unfair to them, and I think we need to find ways, no matter what we do, to expand their ability to go into various areas. And I'm hoping that no matter what happens here, that we allow that to happen, because all of us want solvency. All of us want the Postal Service to not only survive but thrive, and that's one of the ways that hopefully they'll be able to do that.
Would the gentlelady further yield?
I certainly will. I've got 30 seconds left.
I'd ask unanimous consent the gentlelady have an additional 30 seconds. Would the gentlelady yield?
I certainly will.
Thank you. Understanding that it is outside our jurisdiction, understanding that I think no one on the dais is going to in any way fail to understand that postal workers are over 21 years old. Postal workers are among the most trusted people in America. Postal workers oversee the issuance of passports, one of the most sensitive documents. So the idea that we would empower the Post Office, consistent with the 21st Amendment, to verify an adult receiving alcohol at the point of delivery is certainly within the considerations of the American people's trust, and I agree with the gentlelady's comments. We simply have the reality that that particular portion of law is the exclusive jurisdiction, as far as I know, of the judiciary. So I wanted to make sure the gentlelady understood that I had addressed it with it, that I support finding a solution to this problem. At the same time, I recognize it will not be in this bill and cannot be in this bill unless judiciary acts. So, but your bill has been discussed with the chairman, and I plan on following up and would love to follow up with the gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, don't they have the ability to waive jurisdiction?
I've served on that committee for over 12 years. I have never seen Mr. Sensenbrenner, and everyone's laughing here, or the next two, Mr. Smith or Mr. Goodlatte, that waive is not in their lexicon. They're very good at staying with their jurisdiction. And I think the fact that the 21st Amendment has to reflect states' rights exclusively in the distribution is one of the areas that is going to create the possibility that it will be nuanced, consistent with Prohibition and the repeal of Prohibition, which had special areas which their committee is very good at. But the idea that we empower, particularly when we consider, as the gentlelady said, UPS already does it, but Post Office's last mile delivery, we empower some system we're certainly favorable of empowering the Post Office, but the actual 18 U.S.C. Chapter 83, 16, 17, or something like that.
Impressive.
Yeah, well, the fact is, it ain't our jurisdiction. Thank the gentlelady. We now recognize, or for what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for bringing up this bill. It is important that we engage in postal reform, and so I appreciate the work that Mr. Farenthold and others have done. The past chairman, Mr. Ross, I thought did an exceptional job on this topic as well. And I appreciate you moving this forward. I also appreciate the desire of the ranking member and some of the good thoughts that he has in there. I stand opposed to the substitute amendment, but I am supportive of the bill. I do want to remind my colleagues and also the chairman that I don't want it to have this get dislodged by a discussion over alcohol shipments. This is a very tricky, very difficult issue. It's not as simple as offering an amendment, having an 8-minute debate, and then moving on. This is something we have talked about in judiciary. I think it would be an overreach to state the position of Chairman Goodlatte or the Judiciary Committee as a whole. There is a reason that this is not current law. There has been long opposition to this. My state in particular is very sensitive about this issue. We believe as a state we should have the right to make decisions about alcohol policy consistent with the constitutional amendment. And I want to make sure that if the gentlewoman thinks that this is an ongoing problem, that we can have some thorough debate. This has been debated in the past, but let's not lose sight of a good bill getting caught up on alcohol policy. Alcohol policy is not going to be the driving force that's going to reform the Postal Service, employ the hundreds of thousands of good men and women who are there in the Postal Service. One other point that I would like to make here is because I do believe that the Post Office needs more innovation. I have long championed in the short time I've been here that the Post Office needs and must become more relevant in people's lives. There is a line, though, that I don't want to cross, and I want to be careful, and that is I don't want the Postal Service, with its monopoly and favorable tax situation, to become competitive in the private sector to the point that we're going to run small mom and pop or even big, large organizations out of business. An example, I don't want Starbucks to come in and have a national contract to decide to sell coffee in every post office at the expense of a lot of good people who invested, they're paying taxes on property and doing other things. I think that would be a problem. Now, as the gentleman from Virginia suggested, can they engage with their local government? FEMA, I think, is ripe for a very large, sizable contract. They spend millions of dollars trying to remap the United States and figure out how they're going to disperse drugs if there was a hurricane or some disease outbreak. Meanwhile, you have the Postal Service and the postman who knows exactly where people live. They have the points of distribution. Of course those things should happen. The passports, for instance, works exceptionally well. When I think, oh my goodness, I need to get my passport renewed, I think I need to go to the post office. And there should be a host of other services there. I have a very rural district where the state of Utah would benefit by having the Department of Motor Vehicles maybe a couple times a month not go open a whole new office and infrastructure, but contract with the post office to have that service. Everybody knows where it is. They have physical space. And the post office would benefit from that revenue. So I do think that there are a number of things that we could do. What I want to be very cautious of in the language that we put forward is empowering them to compete with the private sector in which there is already somebody offering those services or products, because it's not an even playing field.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask my...
I appreciate your optimism, but I will yield to the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank my colleague. I just ask you an honest question here. Why would we want to interfere with a contract between the Postal Service and a private entity if that private entity thought it was to their competitive advantage? I want to make sure we're not misunderstanding the gentleman from Utah, that you're not in the business of protecting people from competition, are you?
Reclaiming my time.
Sure.
And I appreciate the spirit in which you're asking this. I want to make sure that it's an even playing field. For instance, property taxes are things that the post office doesn't have to engage in, that a local business entity does have to engage in. They're going to be able to essentially get rent and access to a base of customers that would be not on an even playing field. And that's part of the concern. So I'd be happy to work with the gentleman. Again, I do think they have to become more relevant. They do have to innovate. They do. But they have a unique position, and there are services and products that they can offer. But the coffee house example is one that I would use. Is my guess is within fairly close proximity to most post offices, you can find a coffee house. And if suddenly that local coffee house had to compete with the post office, and they don't have the same tax structure and they don't have the same expense structure, you're going to have an uneven playing field. So that's the spirit in which I'm doing this. Again, I appreciate the good work. I think it's a good bill. I urge its passage, but I would encourage the defeat of the substitute amendment with all due respect, and I yield back.
With that, I believe on this amendment, we are now poised to call the question on the amendment. You move to strike the last, right. You want to strike the last word on Cummings? The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you very much.
There will be plenty more amendments, by the way, if you're just generally striking the last word. Gentleman, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really want to thank you and the ranking member for moving us to the point where it looks as though we're going to actually pass something that relates to relief for the Postal Service. Some of us who have served on this committee for an extended period of time have been waiting and looking and seeking that moment. Many of the customers of the Postal Service who have had uncertainties after uncertainties, as well as those who work for the Postal Service, have been wondering when we were going to do something. And so I commend us for the movement. Of course, I support very strongly the Cummings substitute, and I'm pleased to note that both proposals have in several ways similar positions and similar proposals. I think in some they're more explicit. For example, I'm very pleased that both recognize the role of collective bargaining. I think the Cummings substitute is a bit more explicit. I also want to commend the Cummings substitute, Mr. Cummings, for the new products and new ways of generating revenue for the Postal Service while maintaining some of its best traditions. All of us know that this notion of binding and keeping our country together and making sure that every person, no matter where they are and where they live, ought to be able to have universal service, ought to be able to receive communication from other people, notwithstanding the fact that they may live in remote areas. But the thing that I like, I think, perhaps best about the Cummings substitute, in the community where I live and work, there's a tremendous amount of conflict between labor and management. And I think that the Cummings substitute gives us a way of reducing some of the tensions and conflicts that exist between the workforce and the management. That in and of itself becomes enough for me to say that this is a very good piece of legislation. It helps to resolve and solve problems and will probably save a tremendous amount of money just in conflict resolution, trying to resolve those difficulties. So with that, I do express strong support for the Cummings substitute, and yield back the balance.
Would the gentleman yield to the gentleman from Vermont?
Yes.
I thank you. I like your efficiency, Mr. Chairman.
Doing my best.
You know, a couple of things. Number one, I really appreciate the tone of the gentleman from Texas who has worked hard on this bill, and also your tone as well in the specific changes you've made, Mr. Chairman. But I strongly support the Cummings substitute amendment. And I'll tell you why. We got off to a bad start here. we had a big problem in the Postal Service, and it wasn't really caused by an individual. It was caused by technology, and it created a big challenge. But, we've had technological challenges to the Postal Service before. It used to be mail delivered by Pony Express. We had the telegraph. All kinds of things required enormous change, and as change occurred, new opportunities emerged, but it was difficult to see them at the time of enormous stress when the changes were occurring. And when we began this process, one of the things that we did, I think that was a mistake, was we vilified, in my view, a lot of the postal workers, as though the easy way out was to put this excessive burden on them for pre-funding, as though all we had to do was slash positions, as though there was some questionable conduct on the part of postal workers who were not the ones that invented the Internet that took away a lot of the first-class mail. These folks work hard. And, a lot of our veterans are working hard in the Postal Service. I mean, it's amazing the jobs that they do, and it is tough for them. And why can't all of us be pretty proud that we've got these good folks coming back from service, trying to get their way back in to be constructive citizens, and they get a good job in the Postal Service, showing up, delivering our mail, getting to be friendly with each of us when they do. So these are the things we want to preserve. These are good things, and we want to do it together. So the question is how to, and I think that both sides now are on the point of let's try to make this work. And my area, I'm in rural Vermont. It's a big deal when a post office gets closed down. I mean, it's a hard decision, but it's real. It's got real implications for people. It's got real implications for the community. So the Cummings approach is tough. I mean, it ain't going to be easy for anybody in the Postal Service to make these adjustments. But this has been progress, and I strongly support the Cummings effort, and I appreciate the work that the Congressman Maloney and Lynch and Connolly did to help put this together. But I also want to thank the Chairman. I want to thank the gentleman from Texas as well, and I will be supporting the Cummings amendment. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. What purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You move to strike last word.
The last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I wanted to speak because I was troubled in the majority bill here by the creation of the authority. This is an authority that does not appear in Ranking Member Cummings' substitute. I speak in support of that substitute. It was mentioned earlier by the Chairman that the bill, the majority bill, honors the sanctity of existing labor agreements, and I'm concerned that that really isn't the case, that the creation of the authority undermines collective bargaining agreements and the negotiation process. By its own terms, it does control the negotiation process in future CBAs. The authority can basically gut any existing CBA if activated, so that I do have a concern that when we speak of respect that the bill has for collective bargaining rights, that this is simply lip service.
Would the gentleman yield?
More of a veneer. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
Well, I want to make sure that we're looking at the same current version. In the last Congress, before the Meehan Amendment, I would have agreed with you that they had a explicit, what we've done and we believe we've done, and I'll look forward to working with the gentleman after the markup, but we do change an authority's definition and mandate. But the authority that the Control Board has is simply becomes essentially a new Board of Governors. The Board of Governors currently sets that negotiation. It would be no different in the new authority. They would be setting the terms of negotiation. We deliberately want to make sure that our bill, although the mandate of the Control Board and so on is there, basically to break even, in a sense that mandate has always been there for the Board of Governors. They simply haven't lived up to it. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, my read of this proposed bill is that it really does grant additional authority to this authority, basically to gut existing CBAs if activated. and for that reason, as well as the reasons articulated by my colleagues in the minority, I support the substitute instead of the bill being advanced by the majority. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Anyone else seek recognition? If not, then the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Nay. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes. A recorded vote to the amendment has been asked for and will be postposed pursuant to committee rules. Does anyone else wish to offer an amendment? The gentleman from Georgia, do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment 2, H.R. 2748, offered by Mr. Woodall of Georgia.
As they distribute the amendment, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized to explain his amendment.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of discussion today about the trust that the American people put into their postal carriers. For me, my postal carrier growing up was Charlie, and I would always be waiting at the door. I'm one of those folks in a legacy home that Charlie would come by every day at 2:30, and we would, my sister and I would always be there waiting. There seems to be a disconnect, though, sometimes between the kind of trust that we put into folks that we are able to visit with and get to know at a local level, and those folks who are in the management here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Chairman, what my amendment would do is we're focusing so hard on trying to find those dollars for the Postal Service to reinvent itself, is to say during this time, let's place a limit on non-cash awards. As you dig into the compensation packages that are in place for what we call those Level 2 Postal Service executives, those are folks with base salaries up over $200,000 a year. Those folks with total compensation packages often rising above $500,000 a year. We're saying that the Postal Service should not be expending any additional dollars on non-cash awards for those folks. That includes additional paid time off. It includes savings bonds, which oddly are not counted as cash awards. If those maturities are 6 months out, you can distribute those and get around any sort of salary caps that are in place. It is important in any reorganization to make sure that the trust with your customer remains intact. Those people on the front line of the Postal Service are doing everything they can to maintain that trust. This is an amendment to make sure that the folks here at headquarters in Washington, D.C. are doing everything they can to promote that trust during this difficult time as well.
Would the gentleman yield?
Happy to yield to the Chairman.
Okay. I think I and the ranking member both want to talk to you for a second. Look, I think you've done an extremely good job. You've recognized a narrow group of the senior top executives and the potential for the kind of thing which irks rank and file and irks this committee. So I'm certainly prepared to accept your amendment as a really good idea. I think the ranking member also.
I thank the Chairman. I'd be happy to yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I support the amendment offered by the gentleman. The amendment would prohibit Level 2 Postal Service executives from receiving any non-cash award or incentives worth more than $200 while the Postal Service is in a controlled period. Given the Postal Service's fragile financial condition, I think this is a sensible amendment to ensure that the costs are kept down, but employees can still be rewarded for their hard work and their service. And I urge members to adopt the amendment. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. If there is no further discussion, the question appears on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
No.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Let's see if we're going to continue. Just coming back in. Are there any other amendments? The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2748, offered by
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the reading be waived.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment as they distribute the amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would strike Section 306. As you know, 306 requires the Postal Service to remove workers from the Federal Employees Compensation Act. and it establishes a whole separate workers' compensation program. Section 306 also requires that employees that receive workers' compensation be transitioned to a retirement program at their retirement age, and it eliminates added benefits for those with dependents. Since 1916, the principle behind FECA, the Federal Employees Compensation Act, has been that Federal workers should be no better off and no worse off than if they had not been injured or made ill on the job. The Office of Personnel Management defined it as, and I quote, "To provide equity, a retirement benefit should be comparable to the amount the compensationer would have received had they completed their career and not been injured or become ill," close quote. This bill, specifically Section 306, would leave the median worker substantially worse off at retirement age than if they had not been injured or made ill. Quite simply, this amendment that I present is about ensuring postal workers and their survivors are sufficiently protected. It is about fairness. And as an additional point, Mr. Chairman, I would just note, as a longstanding member of both this committee and the Education and Workforce Committee, I would be remiss if I didn't remind the Chairman that Rule 10 of the House vests the Education and Workforce Committee with the primary jurisdiction over all workers' compensation programs. And last year, the Chairman acknowledged as much in a letter to that committee's Chairman. In the 112th Congress, as part of a two-part process, the subcommittee of the Education and Workforce Committee produced a bipartisan FECA reform bill that passed the House and which dealt with issues for which there was a consensus. Unresolved issues were referred to the General Accountability Office for analysis and report. And consistent with that, on July 10th, the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections held a hearing to review the 3 reports from the General Accountability Office. At that hearing, the Congressional Research Service pointed out a key fact. If workers in the Federal Employee Retirement System were permanently disabled early in their careers and then forced into their retirement benefits at age 66, as this postal bill would provide, they would not have Social Security or Thrift Savings Plan contributions. They would not accrue FERS retirement benefits. In essence, they would be substantially worse off at retirement age. And furthermore, in setting up a duplicative workers' compensation program for postal employees, as your bill proposes, wouldn't just result in cuts to benefits. It is also anticipated that it would not yield any savings to the government. In fact, it would be just the opposite. At that July 10th Education Subcommittee hearing, the Department of Labor testified that the administrative cost of setting up a separate postal workers' compensation program could be 4 times higher than the Federal Employees Compensation Act's administrative cost. So, Mr. Chairman, this isn't an abstract exercise, as you know. It's not one where we're engaging in today being any sort of abstract situation. It's in every one of our districts. We see postal employees who are ready to do their routes. Some have suffered injuries on the job. Some have become ill. All of them are trying to heal. And many are finishing their honorable careers in the Postal Service and hoping to retire with dignity. All of them, and the millions of their colleagues, deserve far better than an attempt to remove Postal Service from workers from FECA that would diminish their benefits, leaves them substantially worse off than they otherwise would be, and cost up to 4 times more to implement. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and defer the Education Workforce Committee to the Education Workforce Committee, which has the experience and jurisdiction in these matters and which should be allowed to continue its work towards a bipartisan solution. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment for a number of reasons. First of all, the other committee did not act, because if they had acted, you would not still see individuals receiving higher pay tax-free than they would receive if they were over 65 or even over 70 or even over 80 or even over 90 and had retired. There are currently 102 individuals over the age of 90 years old, and since the last Congress, one has passed over the centurion mark, is now 101 years old, and still receiving 75% of their salary tax-free. As you know, that would be more than they would receive if they were still on the job working. More importantly, the gentleman talks about retirement. Federal workers in the Post Office do not retire if, in fact, a retirement would lower their pay. Instead, they simply stay in this situation, 102 of them over 90, one of them over 101 years old. And congratulations. I wish that individual well and certainly commend them to continue receiving the benefits under the law in place at the time. However, today there are more than 20,000 Postal employees receiving FECA payments, 6,500 are over the age of 61, and in fact 1,700 are over the age of 70. were we simply to keep them where they would be if they served their 20, 25, or 30 years and then pay them as though they had progressed through the process, there would be a large savings to the Post Office. The truth is that although I agree with the gentleman that the Ed and Workforce, Ed and Labor, has jurisdiction, we are not taking their jurisdiction. We are taking a group of individuals pursuant to what the Post Office wants to do and allowing them to be decided separately. Having said that, earlier I announced that I was perfectly willing to accept in conference the Senate's hard work bipartisan reform. They, unlike us, have jurisdiction over the entire Federal workforce. So I join with Senator Carper, I join with Senator Colburn, I join with Senator Susan Collins, and I join with former Senator Joe Lieberman in saying it's time that we do FECA reform. My provision is a place marker so that in conference we may work together with the Senate and bring something that the House can pass. But in fact, I for one would vote today for the bipartisan Senate version when it comes to FECA reform. And I hope the gentleman, in saying that somehow we were not being reasonable, certainly was not believing that paying 75% of salary tax-free to a gentleman over 101 is the equivalent of what that individual would receive in an ordinary retirement. So it is with regret that I did not see the kinds of reforms over the entire Federal workforce in the last Congress coming out of the other committee. It is, in fact, my dedication to working with the Senate on the hard-worked Senate reforms that caused me to want to have FECA in our conference with the full intention, at least as of today, and I do not expect to change, that I would accept the Senate language in its entirety as an acceptable bipartisan. And any negotiation will simply be to ensure that both Houses vote for the conference report when it comes out. So I urge a no on this.
Would the Chairman yield for a question?
Of course.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Senate passed its bill last year. There is no guarantee that the bill they will pass this year will be identical to 1789. Furthermore, the author of
I will tell the gentleman, Senator Susan Collins is still there, and I have talked to both of the Chairman and Ranking Member, and they still intend to do that. The fact is, if we get over to the Senate and find no partners for this reform, we will accept that we cannot dance all alone in the business of making law. But based on what the Senate did last time, based on a substantially similar group of people, including a host of Democrats who want to have a sensible reform in FECA that stops the visual of someone 101 not being retired, but in fact still being considered as the disabled ready to come back to work. And that's the reason that we left it in. I know, Peter, it's that way. And I'm sure in his heart he wants to come back to work. But the fact is, this is a place marker for us, and I appreciate the gentleman from Virginia's question. I also appreciate the gentleman from Massachusetts. FECA reform is tough, and I know that there are different people along the continuum, but I look forward to working with Senator Carper, with the Ranking Member, and I assure this committee that the language that was worked out in the last Congress and anything similar would be fully acceptable to this member.
Chairman.
I now recognize the Ranking Member.
I yield to Mr. Tierney 1.5 minutes of my time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Look, I've heard everything you said, Mr. Chairman. What I'm saying here is that we're looking at a situation where people, when they're injured early in their career or become ill early in their career, don't have the opportunity for Social Security or thrift plans, savings plans, or to accrue FERS retirement benefits, so that they're not substantially in the same position. And to take an anecdotal situation of a person who's 101 and run that as if that's the normal course, I don't think is really fair in the sense of how we're going to have this discussion. The fact of the matter is that the General Accountability Office said that people that